Post-separation legal abuse occurs when an abusive partner weaponizes the court system to maintain control long after the relationship has ended. It is a form of coercive control that hides behind the appearance of legal rights, yet its true purpose is to exhaust, intimidate, and destabilize the victim. When the survivor cannot afford an attorney, the imbalance of the power becomes even more pronounced, and the court system, intended to protect, can become a tool of continued harm. This video explores what happens when a victim is forced to navigate this terrain alone, the tactics commonly used by abusers, and the structural barriers that make justice difficult to access without legal representation. 1. The power imbalance deepens. Legal abuse thrives on asymmetry. When one party has an attorney and the other does not, the courtroom becomes an uneven battlefield. Without an attorney, victims also often face procedural disadvantages. Court rules, deadlines, and filing requirements are complex. Missing even one can harm a case. Intimidation in hearings. Abusers may use aggressive questioning, legal jargon, or emotional manipulation to destabilize the victim. Misinterpretation of rights. Without legal guidance, survivors may not know what objections they can make, what evidence is admissible, or how to respond to false allegations. And judicial bias. Some judges misinterpret a victim's lack of representation as irresponsibility, lack of preparation, or lack of credibility. The abuser, meanwhile, benefits from the appearance of being organized, stable, or more invested, simply because they can afford counsel. 2. Abusers exploit the system more aggressively. When the abuser realizes that the victim is unrepresented, their tactics often escalate. Common strategies include A. Filing excessive motions. Abusers may file repeated custody modifications, emergency motions with fabricated claims, contempt filings, requests for evaluations or investigations. Each filing forces the victim to respond, draining time, money, and emotional energy. B. Manipulating court schedules. Abusers may request frequent hearings, delay proceedings to increase costs, or demand last-minute changes. These tactics are designed to overwhelm the victim and to make them appear disorganized or unreliable. And C. Using the courtroom as a stage. Abusers often perform for the judges, presenting themselves as calm, rational, and concerned, painting the victim as unstable or vindictive, using charm, tears, or rehearsed narratives. Without an attorney to counter these tactics, the victim may struggle to correct the record. 3. Financial hardships become a weapon. Post-separation legal abuse is fundamentally economic abuse in a new form. Victims without attorneys often face lost wages from repeated court appearances, transportation costs for hearings, evaluations, or supervised visits, fees for filing, mediation, or mandated classes, childcare expenses during court proceedings. The abuser's goal is often to force the victim into financial collapse, hoping they will give up custody, drop protective orders, or stop fighting altogether. 4. emotional and psychological toll intensifies. Representing oneself in court is not just a legal challenge, it is an emotional one. Survivors often experience re-traumatization from facing their abuser repeatedly, fear of making mistakes that could affect their children, isolation, since they cannot rely on professional support, and self-doubt, especially when the abuser's attorney attacks their credibility. The courtroom becomes a continuation of the abuse relationship, with the judge and legal system unintentionally serving as intermediaries. 5. The court system often fails to recognize legal abuse. Many courts are not trained to identify coercive control or post-separation abuse. Without an attorney to articulate patterns of behavior, victims may struggle to explain what is happening. Common misunderstandings include judges viewing repeated filings as parental involvement, courts misinterpreting trauma responses as instability, abusers' manipulative behavior being mistaken for cooperation, victims' fear being misread as hostility or non-compliance. This lack of recognition allows legal abuse to continue unchecked. 6. Limited access to legal aid leaves victims unprotected. Legal aid programs are often underfunded, overloaded, restricted by income thresholds, and unable to take complex family law cases. Many survivors fall into the gap too high income for free services, but nowhere near able to afford private counsel. Even when legal aid is available, it may only cover one hearing or one issue, leaving the victim alone for the rest of the case. 7. The consequences can be severe. When a victim cannot afford an attorney, the outcomes can be life-altering. Potential consequences include loss of custody or reduced parenting time, unfair child support or financial orders, continued contact with the abuser through co-parenting, ongoing harassment through the courts, emotional harm to children who witness the conflict, long-term instability for the survivor. The abuser's goal is often not to win legally, but to win psychologically, to break the victim's resolve. 8. What survivors can do without an attorney. While the system is undeniably stacked against unrepresented victims, there are ways to strengthen their position. These are general educational strategies, not legal advice, and can help survivors navigate the process more safely. Document everything. Timelines, messages, financial records, missed visits, threats. Use court self-help centers when available. Seek domestic violence advocates who can help with safety planning and court preparation. Request accommodations if trauma affects communication. Bring a support person for emotional stability. Stay focused on patterns, not isolated incidents, when explaining abuse. Use plain, factual language to counter manipulation. These tools cannot replace an attorney, but they can help survivors maintain clarity and credibility. 9. The system was not built with survivors in mind. Family courts were designed around the assumption that both parties have equal access to representation. Both parties act in good faith. Conflict is mutual rather than one-sided, and abuse ends when the relationship ends. These assumptions are deeply flawed. When a survivor cannot afford an attorney, the court's structural blind spots become glaring. The system often treats abuse as a relationship problem rather than a pattern of domination. It treats repeated filings as parental involvement rather than harassment. It treats trauma responses as instability rather than evidence of harm. Without legal representation that contextualize these dynamics, survivors are left trying to educate the court while simultaneously defending themselves, a nearly impossible task. 10. Children become collateral damage. When a victim is underrepresented, the abuser's legal aggression often spills over onto the lives of the children. Children may experience increased exposure to conflict due to the constant litigation, emotional manipulation by the abusive parent, instability from frequent scheduled changes, fear or confusion when asked to testify or speak to evaluators, disruption of routines, schooling, and social life. Abusers often weaponize the children as leverage, knowing the victim will do anything to protect them. Without an attorney, the survivor may struggle to articulate how the legal conflict itself is harming the children, and courts may overlook the connection entirely. 11. The survivor's voice is often silenced. Legal abuse is not just about filings and hearings. It is about narrative control. When the abuser has an attorney and the survivor does not, the courtroom becomes a place where the abuser's story is polished and rehearsed. The survivor's story is fragmented by trauma. The abuser's attorney frames the narrative. The survivor is left reacting instead of representing. This imbalance can lead to rulings that reflect the abuser's version of reality rather than the truth. Survivors often leave courts feeling erased, misunderstood, or punished for the very abuse that they endured. 12. The long-term impact on survivors. The consequence of navigating post-separation legal abuse without an attorney can echo for years. Some long-term effects may include chronic financial instability, ongoing fear of the court system, reluctance to seek help in the future, emotional exhaustion and burnout, loss of trust in institutions, prolonged contact with the abuser through co-parenting orders, reduced ability to rebuild life after abuse. Legal abuse is not a temporary inconvenience. It is a continuation of the abuser's control strategy, often with the court's unintentional participation. 13. Why this issue demands public attention. Post-separation legal abuse is not a private matter. It is a public safety issue, a gender-based violence issue, and a civil rights issue. It intersects with economic inequality, access to justice, trauma-informed practice, child welfare, judicial education, and domestic violence policy. When survivors cannot afford attorneys, the system effectively rewards the abuser's financial power and punishes the survivor's poverty. This is not justice. It is institutionalized inequality. So what needs to change? Addressing this issue requires systemic reform, not individual resilience. Key areas for improvement include mandatory judicial training on coercive control, legal abuse, expanded legal aid funding for family law cases, court-appointed counsel in high conflict or abuse-related custody cases, penalties for frivolous or abusive filings, trauma-informed courtroom practices, clearer pathways for survivors to request protective measures, and a recognition of legal abuse as a form of domestic violence. Survivors should not have to become legal experts to protect themselves and their children. When a victim of post-separation legal abuse cannot afford an attorney, the courtroom becomes an extension of abuse they are trying to escape. The abuser gains a powerful platform, while the survivor is left to navigate a complex, intimidating system alone. The consequences are profound for the survivor, for the children, and for the integrity of the justice system itself. This is not an individual failure, it is a systemic one. Until courts recognize legal abuse, until survivors have meaningful access to representation, and until the legal system is reformed to understand coercive control, victims will continue to be re-traumatized by the very institutions meant to protect them. Survivors deserve safety. They deserve fairness. And they deserve a legal system that cannot be weaponized against them. And they deserve it regardless of their ability to pay.